Thank you very much for speaking to us today. Good to be here. So, in exactly a week's time, Britain is going to be voting for their next Prime Minister. It's almost certain that you will win the election and you'll be in number 10. And I do have to say, they always say, don't they, that you're never as powerful as when you first enter office. I'm thinking about Tony Blair saying he wishes he'd been bolder quicker. So if you win, what will your first priority be?
Well, the first thing is the caveat. We've got a week to go, and every vote matters, every vote has to be earned, and in individual constituencies there'll be very, very close results, and therefore I don't want to get ahead of myself and be complacent about this, and I do remind everybody that change only happens if you vote for it, and it is important that we keep making that argument into the election. But of course I want to ensure that if we are elected in to serve our country, that we are ready from the get-go, that we can hit the ground running, because many people will feel that the country is being left broken with not anything really working properly under this government, and our job will be to come in to fix that, put the country back on its feet and to rebuild, and we're very ambitious about that in terms of the change we want to see with the NHS, with skills and opportunities, but it has to start with the first steps. What are you going to be doing?
So what is that then? What's the first priority?
The first steps are going to be putting in place the plans for 40,000 extra appointments in the NHS to get the waiting list down each and every week. That's 2 million a year. Making sure that we start the recruitment of the teachers we need in our secondary schools, so all children have the opportunities that they need to go as far as their talents will take them, not be inhibited by the income or salary of their parents. Making sure that we're setting up Great British Energy so that we can deal with energy, renewables, and keep the energy costs down. Here in Stoke, the single thing every business has said to me is our energy bills are too high. These are some of the things that we can begin to do, the first steps, the down payment on the bigger change we need across the country.
You talk there about first steps, and look, I know you don't want to be complacent, and I get that, I totally get that, but at the same time, the polls suggest you're about to be gifted a historic majority, the kind of majority that you get once in a generation, even once in a century. The kind of majority you can be radical with. If you look at Clement Attlee, when he won a historic majority in 1945, he created the NHS. When Stanley Baldwin did the same in 1924, he gave women the vote. What's Keir Starmer going to do? It sounds like these are just quite small first steps. Are you going to waste the opportunity?
Well, firstly, I'm not going to get ahead of myself and predict what's actually going to happen in the general election, because every vote does have to be
But I'm asking what you would do if you were Prime Minister, because you could do a lot.
Yeah, the first steps are a down payment. They're not all that we want to do, but until we get the waiting list down, frankly, we're going to struggle with the change that we need, because we can't get our economy going. We need to stabilise our economy.
But you might not be as powerful as when you first get into office. That's kind of my point.
But those first steps are really important, because I think people are asking us two questions. Do you understand the problems I'm facing, and have you got a first step to deal with it? So I actually know I'm going to get my operation, because if you can't get that fixed, I'm not going to have confidence in you making sure the NHS is fit for the future. But it's a first step to an NHS which is fit for the next 75, 76 years. That means changing the very model of the NHS and reforming the NHS to move it to a preventative model, to make much greater use of AI, to make sure that it's much more community-based. These are big changes that we've got in place for the NHS, because you talk about the great projects of last Labour governments. Creating the NHS is one we celebrate every year. I want to make sure that in 50, 60, 70 years, people are celebrating the fact that an incoming Labour government in 2024 made sure the NHS was not something we look proudly back on, but actually built fit for the future.
I guess this is the point, because to take the NHS for an example, you say the NHS isn't on its knees but on its face, but what you're proposing is just a 1.1% increase in spending, and it's not just the NHS. Climate, for example, would be another example. You say you want a zero carbon electricity system by 2030, but you're now saying you're going to spend 6 times less than you did in 21 making that happen. It feels pretty timid, I've got to say.
Well, the first thing is that if you're on a waiting list and you need your hip replaced or your knee replaced or whatever it may be, saying you're going to get your operation isn't timid, it's vital.
I'm saying that 1.1% increase in spending is timid.
So this is change worth having. The bigger change for the NHS on AI, on tech, is really important part of the future of the NHS. As is GB Energy, a publicly owned energy company which we will set up. It'll be based in Scotland. That will rush towards a 2030 clean power target which will ensure that we get energy security, lower energy bills, and the next generation of jobs. These are big changes. Countries don't go through sort of energy transitions that frequently. This is a big moment for our country.
You said you were going to spend £28 billion on that, and now you've reduced it to £4.7 billion a year, 6 times less. It feels like you've started radical and you've become more and more timid.
No, the objective has always been clean power by 2030. And I've not moved that.
If you don't get it, well, you've failed.
I have checked that every single thing we need to get to 2030 is in place, fully costed and fully funded. We do need investors to come up alongside us on this project. We've been talking to them now for the best part of 2 years about the conditions they need to come up and partner with us on this. And most of them say it's going to be difficult, but it's doable. And that's the sort of challenge I like. Difficult, but doable. And what a massive change it will make. Because when we went from into coal and then from coal to oil and gas, these were big moments in our country's history. We're about to go through the next transition to renewables. If we get this right, we can be a world leader on the next generation of jobs and have jobs which are measured not just in years but decades.
It feels sometimes like, I think many people would agree there are big issues facing the country. You're good at diagnosing the problems. You say that there's a climate emergency, but you scale back the green plans. You say the army's been hollowed out, but then you won't commit to increasing it. You say child poverty levels are intolerable, but you want to keep the 2-child limit on benefits.
Well, let me just push back on that a little, if you don't mind, because look, the biggest problem, I'll diagnose the problem, because we've heard it again this afternoon, which is energy bills are so high that some of the businesses in Stoke are going bust. Now, I hear that across the whole of the country. The cost of living crisis, energy bills. So how are we going to address that? We're going to set up GB Energy. We're going to go for clean power by 2030. It is difficult to do. That carries with it much lower bills, not for a year or two, but actually for decades to come. That is big change, desperately needed. That's not diagnosis. That is diagnosis followed by what actually needs to change in order to deliver it. And that's the sort of long-term thinking that we haven't had over the last 14 years, fixing the fundamentals so we can move forward as a country. One
of the parts of your manifesto that I find quite interesting that I haven't spoken to you about before is your commitment to put VAT on private schools. It feels like that's a row you're quite happy to have. And if I'm honest with you, I'm a bit confused by some of the arguments against this, right? Saying that private schools will close, for example, if it's introduced. Why wouldn't private schools just increase class sizes or cut staff and make, I guess, the kind of economic decisions that the state sector has to make all the time? Do you think that actually, private schools should have to make the kind of, cut their cloth in the same way that all the other schools do?
Yes, I think they will adapt, and they've had lots of increases in costs over the last 10, 14 years. And they've accommodated it, and there's no evidence to show that these schools will close. They don't have to pass the cost on to parents, but it is a tough choice, it's a difficult choice. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that this is ideological or easy, because I do understand that many parents work hard and save hard to send their children to private school, but because they've got aspiration for their child. But every single parent has aspiration for their child, including every parent of a child in a state secondary school. And at the moment, we don't even have teachers in core subjects in secondary schools, state secondary schools, in subjects like maths. So we've got PE teachers and supply teachers teaching maths to young people in our state secondaries. That's not on, because it's going to hold them back. And one of the things I made absolutely clear is I'm determined to stop the over-reliance we have, where too many children, their future is determined by the income and salary of their parents rather than their talent. I've absolutely got that in my sights as something we are going to change with an incoming Labour government.
It's quite a popular policy, polls quite well. Do you think that some of the backlash against it has been because there's so many people in Westminster and the media who either went to private school or send their children there?
I think there's an element of that, but parents across the country do say to me, if they've got children in private school, that they're concerned about it, and I go through the reason why we're doing it with them, explain to them that schools don't have to pass it on to them. So I'm not. So you think
it's not a bad thing if private schools have to make economies?
It's a difficult choice, but they're businesses in the end, and they're very successful in the round. Actually, under this government, 1,000 private schools have closed because their business didn't work. Now, I want them to thrive, But we need to make this difficult choice, because in the end, if I want the teachers we need in our state secondary schools, I have to answer the question which you would put to me, which is, how are you going to pay for that? You're going to pay for that by getting rid of the tax breaks for private schools and use it to invest in the teachers we need in our state secondaries.
I'm quite interested in, I guess, your own kind of experiences of this, because your school went private when you were there. You didn't pay, of course, but it did go private when you were there. How did you sort of feel about it at the time? Did you agree with the decision?
I had nothing to do with it.
No, but how did you feel about it?
I don't think I even appreciated it. And if you ask all the people that were at school with me, we started off as state grammar boys, paid for by the local authority, and we ended up as state grammar schools, paid for by the local authority. But the school must have
changed a bit though when you were there, though.
No.
I guess I'm just wondering, your mother was obviously very ill growing up. You've spoken about not being able to afford to fix windows in your home. You must have noticed the privilege around you.
I didn't notice, but the reason for that is that you had the whole school, the whole cohort were state grammar school boys, and all of them were supported through. So everybody in the school the day before the change was exactly the same as everybody after the change, and the funding was still from the local authority. So that didn't materially change. It's obviously very different now. But it is very important to me that every child has those opportunities. Yeah, I mean, look, we didn't have a lot of money when I was growing up. We couldn't make ends meet on a number of occasions. Not pleading great poverty, but I do know what it means to feel or fear the next bill coming through through the letterbox. And a lot of people are going through that at the moment in this cost of living crisis. And politics is about, as you rightly say, our policies, our ambition. It is also about, who do you have in your mind's eye when you make your decisions? And I have in my mind's eye all the people that want to get on for themselves, their families, their communities, and ultimately their country, because I think that's the vast majority of people in this country who are reasonably minded, pretty tolerant, want to pull the country together and move it forward.
We are out of time, but just finally, what's more likely, you winning the election or England winning the Euros?
Well, I can't have both, I don't suppose.
No. Absolutely not.
The more important one is winning the election, but don't let that be any sort of reflection on... I say get behind the team when it comes to England. We've got really good players.
You were pictured wearing a white shirt watching England. What happened to your England shirt? Was it in the wash?
I'd been on the road all day with the campaign, and so...
You found it now that Scotland had been knocked out?
Well, I did watch the Scotland game as well.
Okay. Thank you very much. Great to have you on the programme today. Thank you.
Great, thank you.